The battlefield outside the ruins of the Avengers compound was already the worst thing any of them had ever seen. Thanos had done what no villain before him had managed. He had come to them, crashed through time and space with an army of millions at his back, and turned the ground into a graveyard before the first real blow was even exchanged. Portals were opening across the scorched field, heroes pouring through from every corner of the known universe, and still it wasn't enough. Every calculation Tony Stark had run in the back of his mind since the moment the sky split open told him the same thing. They were losing. They had the plan, they had the people, but Thanos had the weight of inevitability, and that was something no suit of armor had ever been built to stop. Then something fell from the sky that none of them had planned for. Not a hero, not a weapon, not a portal, just a man in a white cape and a yellow bodysuit, landing in the middle of the battlefield with the casual energy of someone who had stepped off a bus at the wrong stop. He looked around at the fire, the alien armies, the crumbling earth, and the distant figure of Thanos bearing down on them all, and he sighed, like he was mildly disappointed he'd ended up here again. Nobody knew who he was. Nobody knew where he came from, and not a single person on that field understood yet that the entire outcome of the day had just changed the moment he touched down. This is only the beginning, and what happens next is far worse than anyone was prepared for. If you make it past the first few minutes of this story, you already understand this isn't going to go the way anyone expects. Subscribe now, because what's coming in the later parts of this series cannot be unseen, and you'll want to be here when it arrives. The portal that deposited Saitama onto the battlefield outside the ruined Avengers compound had not been opened intentionally. Nobody on either side had summoned him, nobody had planned for his arrival, and the universe, for all its infinite complexity, had simply made a mistake the way universes occasionally do when time travel is involved, and people who should know better start punching holes through the fabric of reality. One moment Saitama had been standing in his apartment in City Z, staring at a flyer for a grocery store sale that ended at midnight. And the next moment, he was standing on scorched earth surrounded by fire, screaming, the distant thunder of alien warships overhead, and what appeared to be several thousand creatures made of gray muscle and bad intentions charging directly at him from across a broken plain. He stood there for a moment and looked at all of it. The burning sky, the crack in the earth where the compound used to be, the armored figures fighting desperately across a field that stretched further than he could easily see in every direction. He scratched the back of his head beneath his yellow gloves and turned slowly, the way a man does when he's trying to figure out which train platform he's supposed to be on. Nothing around him matched anything from his dimension. The aliens were real, the explosions were real, and the general atmosphere of catastrophic loss was absolutely real, but none of it registered to Saitama as something requiring immediate emotional investment. It registered as inconvenient, the way a traffic jam is inconvenient, and he stood in the middle of it trying to decide what the most practical thing to do was. The most practical thing turned out to be getting out of the way of the charging army, which was now close enough that the ground was trembling under its momentum. Saitama stepped to the side. The first wave of outriders, thousands of them, moving in a mass that had already overwhelmed portions of the Avengers' defensive line, swept past the position where he had just been standing, and then several hundred of them ran directly into him from the side because he had stepped sideways rather than backward. The impact for them was the kind of thing that ends armies. For Saitama, it was the feeling of walking through a bead curtain. He didn't punch anything. He didn't throw anything. He just stood there while the creatures crashed into him at full running speed, and each one that made contact stopped existing as a coherent physical object in any meaningful sense. The shockwave from the accumulated impacts rolled outward across the dirt in a ring that flattened everything within 30 meters, and left a perfect circle of silence around the man in the yellow suit. 300 meters away, James Rhodes inside his War Machine armor caught the energy signature on his sensors, and his tactical display lit up with a reading it had never produced before. His suit's threat assessment system tried 3 times to classify what had just happened and returned an error each time. He opened a channel to Tony immediately, because what he had just watched from across the battlefield was a single standing figure absorb a charge from what his sensors counted as approximately 400 outriders, and produce an impact event that registered on the seismic layer of his suit's environmental feedback system. "Tony," he said, "I need you to look at Sector 7 right now and tell me what I'm looking at, because my system thinks a man just stopped an army charge by existing." Tony Stark, currently in the middle of his own engagement 40 meters away, rerouted a fraction of his processing power to pull Rhodes' camera feed. He watched the replay twice in the span of 1 second. The figure in the white cape was already looking in a different direction, apparently having lost interest in the 400 creatures that had just disintegrated against him. Tony's suit ran a rapid analysis, mass, force, energy transfer, biological signature, and came back with conclusions that contradicted each other so fundamentally that the system flagged its own results as corrupted data. He didn't say anything on the channel for 3 full seconds, which for Tony Stark was a geological epoch of silence. Then he said, quietly and without his usual theatrical confidence, "I have no idea what I'm looking at." Across the battlefield, Saitama found a slightly less chaotic patch of ground to stand on and watched the fighting continue around him, waiting to see if anything interesting was going to happen. The thing about Thanos' army was that it had been designed to overwhelm through sheer scale. Every tactical calculation the Avengers had run since the moment the time-inverted warship appeared above the compound had arrived at the same uncomfortable conclusion. There were simply too many of them. The Outriders didn't think, didn't negotiate, didn't retreat, and didn't feel the kind of fear that makes an army hesitate at a critical moment. They were a mechanism, not a force, and mechanisms don't stop until something physically breaks them. That had always been the mathematical problem sitting at the center of the endgame battle. The heroes could fight brilliantly, could coordinate perfectly, could sacrifice everything they had, and the numbers would still grind them down eventually because attrition favored the side with more bodies. What nobody had accounted for, in any version of any plan, was the introduction of a variable that made the concept of numerical advantage completely meaningless. Saitama had started walking. That was the most accurate way to describe what was happening in the middle of the battlefield, and it was also the most absurd, because the direction he was walking happened to be directly into the densest concentration of Thanos' ground forces. He wasn't charging. He wasn't running. He wasn't performing any of the aggressive forward momentum that heroes use when they're trying to signal intent or intimidate an opposing force. He was walking the way someone walks through a crowded market when they know roughly where they want to end up, but aren't in a particular hurry to get there. The Outriders engaged him the moment he entered their mass, which was the natural thing for them to do, and the results were immediate and complete, and happened so fast that the heroes watching from across the field initially couldn't process what they were seeing as a single connected sequence of events. Every Outrider that reached Saitama ceased to be a problem, not defeated in the conventional sense, not thrown back, not stunned, not driven off. Each creature that made contact with him or received the most casual deflection from his arm or shoulder simply stopped being a functional part of the battle. A group of 30 would converge, and a moment later there would be a pressure wave moving outward through the surrounding bodies like a stone dropped in water, and the 30 would be gone and Saitama would be 2 steps further along than he had been. He wasn't even fully committing to the action. His hands were sometimes in his pockets between engagements. At one point, he paused to look up at one of the warships overhead with mild curiosity, before an Outrider lunged at him from the left, and he redirected it into approximately 40 of its companions, with a movement so economical it barely registered as effort. Captain America saw it from 70 meters away while holding a defensive position near a section of collapsed wall. He had fought enhanced humans, super soldiers, gods, and aliens, and he had developed a fairly reliable internal calibration for assessing what a fighter was capable of based on how they moved and what it cost them to do it. Every fighter he had ever encountered showed some evidence of expenditure, a slight adjustment in stance, a fraction more deliberate breath, some micro-signal in the body that indicated effort was being translated into action. He watched the figure in the yellow suit move through the Outrider mass for a full 30 seconds and found none of those signals anywhere. The man moved like the army wasn't a serious physical obstacle, not like he was suppressing effort. Like the effort genuinely wasn't there to suppress. Steve Rogers had seen Thor fight. He had seen Vision, Scarlet Witch, and the Hulk at their most unleashed. None of them had looked like this, and what bothered him more than anything else was that the man in the yellow suit looked bored. He opened a channel to Natasha, who was still active on the eastern perimeter. "There's an unknown combatant in the center of the Outrider mass," he said, keeping his voice even because he had long ago trained himself not to let confusion sound like panic on comms. "He's clearing them. Fast. I don't know whose side he's on and I don't know what he is, but right now he's doing more damage to their ground forces than our entire eastern flank." There was a pause from Natasha's end, the kind of pause that meant she was watching what he was describing and coming to the same uncomfortable absence of conclusions. "Do we approach?" she asked. Steve watched Saitama stop in the middle of the battlefield, look down at something on the ground with what appeared to be mild curiosity, and then look up at the ongoing battle around him with the patient expression of someone waiting for a kettle to boil. "Not yet," Steve said. "Let's see what he does next." What he did next was notice a group of Outriders had surrounded a fallen hero near the northern edge of the engagement, and walk over to address that situation with the same unhurried energy he had applied to everything else. And the situation was addressed in the time it took Steve to draw 2 full breaths. The hero on the ground, one of the Wakandon warriors who had come through the portal, looked up from the dirt at the man who had just cleared her immediate surroundings and received a brief, casual glance in return before Saitama looked away again, already scanning the broader field with the mild, searching expression of someone who still hadn't found whatever it was they were looking for. Tony Stark had built his entire intellectual identity around the premise that everything could be understood if you had enough data and enough processing power to interpret it correctly. That belief had carried him through inverse particle physics, time travel theory, the reconstruction of an Infinity Stone's energy signature from memory, and approximately 40 other problems that should have been impossible by any reasonable definition of the word. It was the foundational assumption underneath everything he had ever built, the axiom that made all the other axioms work, and he had never seriously encountered a situation that challenged it at its root rather than just at its edges. He was encountering one now, and it was making him deeply, genuinely uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the battle still raging around him. He had pulled every sensor his suit possessed onto the unknown fighter in Sector 7, the moment Rhodes flagged the anomaly, and he had been running continuous analysis for 4 minutes while simultaneously managing his own engagements across the field. 4 minutes of uninterrupted data collection on a single subject, with the most sophisticated portable scanning system ever built by human hands, and what he had was a readout that kept contradicting itself in ways that shouldn't be physically possible. The energy output registered every time the figure made contact with an Outrider was not coming from any external source. No gauntlet, no stone, no suit, no weapon. It was originating from the man's body, which was straightforward enough as biological power systems went, except that the numbers the suit was returning for the output magnitude were numbers that Tony's system normally reserved for events like supernovae and the detonation of large stellar bodies. The suit had a ceiling for force measurement that had been set deliberately high because Tony had fought gods and needed the headroom. The readings from this man were hitting that ceiling, and then the system was flagging the ceiling itself as potentially insufficient. He landed 40 meters from Saitama's current position and ran a direct optical scan while the battle continued around them both. Up close, the suit's facial recognition found nothing. No database match anywhere, not SHIELD, not Hydra's recovered files, not any international enhanced individual registry Tony had access to, which was all of them. The yellow suit had no manufacturer signature, no embedded technology, no energy source. The cape moved the way fabric moves, not the way advanced material moves. The boots were rubber. Tony stood there in $12 billion worth of armor looking at a man in what amounted to a Halloween costume, and felt the specific intellectual vertigo of a person who has just realized the map they've been using doesn't cover the territory they're standing in. "Hey," Tony said, because he had fought enough impossible things to know that sometimes the direct approach was the only one left. Saitama turned and looked at him with the mild, appraising expression of someone who has just been addressed by a stranger in a parking lot. He looked at the armor, then at Tony's faceplate, then back at the battle behind him as if checking whether something more interesting was happening over there. "You with these guys?" Saitama asked, nodding vaguely in the direction of the Avengers' defensive line. "Yeah," Tony said carefully. "Are you?" Saitama considered this for a moment with the seriousness of a man deciding whether to get the medium or large coffee. "I guess so," he said. "I'm not with the other ones." Tony processed this answer and found it technically sufficient and also completely useless. "Where did you come from?" he asked. Saitama scratched the side of his head. "City Z," he said. "There was a grocery sale." Tony stared at him for 2 seconds. His suit, still running continuous analysis, returned a new flag in that moment. A structural integrity scan it had been running on Saitama's body since the conversation began, checking bone density, muscle composition, cellular structure. The results came back and Tony read them inside his helmet and said nothing for a long moment. The scan had found nothing abnormal. Not enhanced bone density the way Steve had. Not cellular regeneration the way Wolverine's file described. Not energy saturation the way Thor's body registered. Just a completely ordinary human biological structure, unremarkable in every measurable dimension, sitting inside a body that had just demonstrated the force output of a stellar event. His suit had no framework for this. The science didn't have a framework for this. Tony closed the scan results and opened a new channel to Bruce Banner, who was currently operating as Smart Hulk near the western flank. "Bruce," he said quietly, "I need you to come look at something, and I need you to not make it weird when you get here." Meanwhile, on the far side of the battlefield, Thanos had paused in his advance. Not because anything had stopped him. Nothing on that field had stopped him yet, and he knew it. He had paused because one of his commanders, the Outrider Mass Coordination Unit that processed battlefield positioning, had just sent him a signal indicating a statistically impossible attrition rate in the center ground forces. The number of units lost in the center sector in the last 4 minutes was a figure that should have required a sustained assault by multiple enhanced combatants working in coordinated formation for at least 20 minutes. The figure responsible appeared to be a single individual. Thanos looked across the field toward the center sector, where the battle was continuing to resolve in ways his projections had not accounted for, and he narrowed his eyes with the careful, measuring attention of a being who has spent centuries learning to recognize threats that don't announce themselves the conventional way. He said nothing to his commanders. He simply began paying a different kind of attention to the man in the yellow suit. Thor had a sense for power that had nothing to do with instruments or analysis or any system built by mortal hands. It was something older than Asgard, older than the name Odinson, something that lived in the part of him that had stood in the presence of things older than stars, and learned to read the weight of what they carried the way a sailor reads, whether in the texture of wind. He had felt it in Odin at the height of his strength, felt it radiating from the Infinity Gauntlet the moment Thanos closed his fist around all 6 stones on Titan, felt it in the Tesseract when he was young, and didn't understand what he was feeling but knew instinctively to treat the object with a category of respect that went beyond the merely dangerous. It was a recognition that operated below conscious thought, a signal the body sent before the mind had finished forming the question. He felt it now, crossing the battlefield toward the center sector after Tony's channel request had been forwarded through the team frequency. And what he felt stopped him walking for a full 3 seconds in the middle of an active engagement, because the signal was coming from the wrong direction, and at the wrong scale for anything he could rationally account for. It was coming from the man in the yellow suit, not the Infinity Gauntlet, not the warships overhead, not the accumulated cosmic energy of the portal network that had deposited half the universe's defenders onto this field. The man in the yellow suit, standing in the cleared center of what had been the densest concentration of ground forces on the battlefield, looking at a piece of debris he had picked up with the mild interest of someone examining something they found on a sidewalk. Thor stood at the edge of the cleared ground and looked at him and felt the signal clearly, and couldn't make it mean anything coherent, because what he was feeling from this man was not the structured, sourceable power of a god or a stone or an ancient weapon. It was something underneath all of those categories, something that predated the frameworks he used to understand power in the first place, and the closest comparison his mind could reach for was the feeling he sometimes got standing at the edge of something vast in the dark, not the thing itself, but the awareness that the thing existed, and that his own scale relative to it was not what he had assumed. He approached anyway, because Thor had never once in his life responded to something he didn't understand by staying away from it. Saitama looked up from the piece of debris as he got close, registered the armor and the lightning with the same mild interest he had applied to Tony's suit, and then registered Mjolnir's replacement, the Axe Stormbreaker, with a slightly longer look, the way someone might look at an unusually large tool they hadn't seen before. "You are the one clearing the center," Thor said, because he had learned from a long life that starting a conversation with what you already know sometimes gets you to what you don't know faster. Saitama nodded. "There were a lot of them," he said, as though this explained and concluded the matter entirely. Thor looked at the radius of cleared ground around them, which extended in every direction for several hundred meters and contained nothing living that hadn't been there before Saitama arrived. "There were," Thor agreed carefully. "How did you get here?" Saitama looked briefly troubled by this question, not because he found it threatening but because the honest answer was genuinely strange even to him. "I was going to buy cabbage," he said. "The sale was for midnight. There was a light and then I was here." Thor processed this. "A light," he repeated. "Yes," Saitama said, "a round one." Thor had encountered enough dimensional anomalies over his centuries to recognize the description of a portal event, but the specific type of portal that deposited someone from an entirely separate universe into the middle of a multiversal convergence event was not something he had a clean category for. What he did have a clean category for was the feeling still radiating from the man in front of him, which had not diminished at closer range and was in fact slightly more intense now, the way a sound gets clearer when you move toward it rather than louder in a way that implies danger. He made a decision based on instinct rather than analysis, the way he had always made his best decisions. "There is a battle happening," he said, "a very large one. The man responsible for it intends something that cannot be allowed." Saitama looked past Thor at the ongoing fighting with the expression of someone being given directions to somewhere they might visit later if nothing else came up. "The big purple one?" he asked. Thor nodded. "The big purple one," he confirmed. Saitama looked in Thanos' direction for a moment, then back at Thor. "Is he the strongest one here?" he asked. The question was delivered with genuine curiosity, not aggression, not anticipation, the tone of someone asking whether a movie was any good before deciding whether to watch it. Thor opened his mouth to answer and found the honest answer considerably more complicated than it had been 20 minutes ago. "He was," Thor said, and left the qualification sitting in the air between them because he didn't know how else to finish the sentence accurately. Across the field, Bruce Banner had arrived at Tony's position and was looking at the data feed Tony had projected from his suit's analysis array. Bruce was quiet for longer than Tony was comfortable with, because Bruce's silence during data review had a different texture than other people's silence. It was the silence of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at and was taking time to decide how alarmed to be about it. "The force output numbers," Bruce finally said. "I know," Tony said. "They can't be right." "They're not wrong," Tony said. "The suit has never returned corrupted force data in a combat environment. I've tested it against Thor, against the Hulk, against a nuclear detonation at close range. The ceiling is set where it is because I needed it to cover everything I'd ever reasonably encounter." Bruce looked at the ceiling flag the suit had returned, the notation that the measurement system itself might be inadequate. "So you're telling me," Bruce said slowly, "that your suit literally cannot measure how hard this man hits?" Tony looked at Saitama, standing in the center of the cleared ground talking to Thor with his hands in his pockets, and said, "That's what I'm telling you." The plan had always depended on the gauntlet. Every version of every strategy the Avengers had assembled across the 5 years since the snap, every argument, every sacrifice, every impossible calculation that had brought them to this moment on this field, all of it converged on a single operational requirement: get the stones away from Thanos and use them to undo what he had done. That was the whole architecture. Everything else was scaffolding built to support that one load-bearing objective. And the scaffolding was currently being destroyed faster than anyone had anticipated, because Thanos had come prepared for a version of this battle that was already outdated the moment Saitama landed on the field. The ground forces that were supposed to tie up the Avengers' combat capacity, while Thanos moved on the gauntlet, were being reduced to irrelevance in the center sector at a rate that was visibly destabilizing his tactical formation. And the commanders feeding information to Thanos from across the battlefield were sending him numbers that didn't make sense against any opponent profile in his library. What nobody had fully accounted for yet was how this changed the gauntlet problem. The original plan required the stones to be moved through a contested field, while the Avengers held the line, a relay system that depended on every link in the chain surviving long enough to pass the object forward. With the center sector clearing faster than anyone had projected, there was suddenly a corridor of reduced resistance cutting through the middle of the battlefield, and Tony's tactical system flagged it within seconds of the pattern becoming statistically clear. He shared the flag across the command channel and immediately heard the team's reaction shift from desperate defense to something that sounded almost like a recalculation. "If that corridor holds," Rhodey said from his position, "we have a transfer window that wasn't in any of our models." "It holds as long as he stays in it," Tony replied, and the word "he" was the part of that sentence that everybody on the channel heard and didn't fully know how to process, because he referred to a man none of them had a file on who had no apparent reason to stay anywhere doing anything on their behalf. Steve Rogers made the decision that needed to be made, because that was the job he had given himself, and he had never once failed to do it even when it was the most uncomfortable available option. He moved across the field towards Saitama's position, taking the fastest route through the cleared ground, and arrived while Saitama was still in conversation with Thor. Thor gave Steve a look that conveyed approximately 6 different things simultaneously, most of them in the general category of "I know how this looks and I don't have better information for you yet." Steve looked at Saitama directly. "We need to move something across this field," he said, skipping the preliminary framing because the battle didn't have time for it. "The thing we're moving is the only thing that can end this. The man who started all of this is going to try to stop us." Saitama listened to this with the focused attention of someone who is genuinely trying to follow a set of directions in an unfamiliar city. "The purple one," he said. Steve nodded. "The purple one," he confirmed. "What does he want with it?" Saitama asked. Steve paused for half a second because the question was so practically framed that it momentarily cut through all the mythological weight of the situation and just asked the operational core of it. "He wants to use it to decide who lives and who doesn't," Steve said. "For everyone." Saitama's expression shifted slightly, not to anger or horror, but to the mild, unimpressed look of someone who has just been told something they find philosophically unremarkable but logistically inconvenient. "That's a lot of work," he said. "It is," Steve agreed. "Will you help us?" Saitama looked across the field toward where Thanos was now visibly moving, the massive figure cutting through the battle with the unstoppable momentum of something that had already decided the outcome. He shrugged in a way that communicated neither reluctance nor enthusiasm, but simply a practical willingness to continue being useful. "Sure," he said. What happened in the following 4 minutes was the closest thing to a controlled demolition of an army the battlefield had ever produced, except it was controlled entirely by one man's walking pace, and the army was not being dismantled with any obvious strategic intent, but simply because it was in the way. Saitama moved along the corridor Tony's system had flagged, and the outrider concentrations that had been compressing back into that space found themselves addressed with the same casual efficiency he had applied to everything else. Tony watched the corridor stabilize from the air and felt something genuinely strange happen in his chest, which was the specific sensation of a plan he had written off starting to become executable again. He relayed the transfer window to the team, and the gauntlet began moving. The relay chain formed. The Avengers, battered and exhausted and still outnumbered on every flank that the corridor hadn't reached, found the specific second wind that comes not from rest, but from the sudden reopening of a possibility that had seemed permanently closed. Thanos watched the corridor form and understood what it meant immediately, because Thanos had spent centuries thinking in terms of large systems and the behavior of large systems under unexpected pressure. And what he was watching was his own tactical formation being reorganized by a single variable he had not modeled. He changed his vector. He stopped moving toward the gauntlet's projected relay path and moved instead toward the center of the corridor, toward the figure in the yellow suit who was the reason the corridor existed, because Thanos had not survived as long as he had by waiting for problems to reach full maturity before addressing them. He moved with the full weight of his own power behind every step, and the earth cracked under him as he closed the distance, and the commanders around him scrambled to compensate for the vector change, and the entire shape of the battle shifted in response, because when Thanos moved with intent, the battlefield reorganized itself around that intent like water around a stone. He had not decided yet what the man in the yellow suit was. He had decided that finding out could not wait any longer. Saitama heard the change in the ground before he saw the cause of it. He stopped walking and turned, and across 150 meters of broken earth, he looked at the approaching figure of Thanos for the first time from a distance close enough to see his face clearly. He studied him for a moment with the careful, quiet attention of someone finally looking at the thing everyone has been talking about. Then, in a tone of mild professional interest rather than any kind of excitement, he said to no one in particular, "Oh, so that's him." The 150 meters between them closed faster than the Avengers could react to reposition around it. Thanos moved with the kind of velocity that his size made deceptive, every step covering ground that would have taken a normal person 3 strides. His body, a coherent instrument of applied force that had been refined over centuries of conflict against opponents who had ranged from the merely powerful to the cosmically significant. He had defeated the Hulk without the stones. He had fought Thor to a standstill. He had taken a wound from Stormbreaker that should have ended him and kept moving. The physical architecture of Thanos was not the armor or the gauntlet or the army at his back. It was the absolute, battle-tested certainty that nothing in the known universe could match him in direct physical confrontation, and that this certainty had been tested enough times against enough opponents to have graduated from confidence to established fact. He crossed the 150 meters and brought his double-edged sword around in an opening strike that had ended every engagement it had ever been the opening strike of, a blow carrying the full momentum of his approach and the full structural weight of his body behind it, directed at the center of the figure in the yellow suit, who had not moved from the position where he had stopped walking. The sword connected. The shockwave from the impact rolled outward across the battlefield in a visible pressure ring that flattened outriders and heroes alike for 30 meters in every direction, and kicked up a wall of dirt and debris that briefly obscured the point of contact from anyone watching at distance. For one full second, nobody on the field could see what had happened at the center of that impact. Tony's sensors went white from the energy displacement. Thor, who had been moving towards Saitama's position when the strike landed, stopped and felt the ground shake under him with the specific frequency that meant something enormous had just transferred its energy into the earth. Every Avenger on the field who had been watching the approaching confrontation had their attention locked on that obscured center point, and the collective held breath of the entire battlefield lasted for exactly the 1 second it took the debris cloud to clear enough to resolve the figures inside it. Saitama was standing in the same position. He had not been moved. He had not braced. There was no widened stance, no planted foot, no visible adjustment of posture that would indicate he had prepared to receive the blow. He was standing the way he had been standing before the strike landed, with the same relaxed, slightly slouched posture of a man waiting for a bus, and the sword that had connected with his side was still in contact with him because Thanos had not yet processed what the feedback from the impact was telling his hands. What it was telling his hands was nothing comprehensible. The force he had put into that strike had not transferred. It had not been absorbed in any way he could identify, not braced against, not deflected, not countered through any technique he recognized. It had simply failed to accomplish what force had always accomplished in every context he had ever applied it in. And the part of Thanos that was a very old and very experienced combatant recognized this feedback before the part of him that was a philosopher and an ideologue had finished processing the situation. And what that combatant part recognized sent a signal through his system that he had not felt in a very long time. He recognized it after a moment because it was rare enough that the memory of it was stored somewhere deep and infrequently accessed. It was the signal his body sent when it had just encountered something it didn't know how to beat. Saitama looked down at the sword still in contact with his side, and then looked up at Thanos with the expression of someone who has just been tapped on the shoulder by a stranger and is waiting to find out what they wanted. Thanos withdrew the sword slowly, which was itself a communication. The first time in this battle he had done anything slowly, and looked at the figure in front of him with the complete, measuring attention he reserved for things that required it. "You felt that," Thanos said. It was not a question. It was the beginning of an assessment. Saitama considered it honestly. "A little," he said. "It was okay." The two words landed in the space between them with a weight that had nothing to do with volume. Thanos studied him in silence for a moment, cataloging everything his centuries of combat experience could extract from what he was looking at: the posture, the stance, the eyes, the total absence of any physiological stress response in a body that had just received a direct strike from him at full force. He found nothing that fit any category he had ever used to classify an opponent. "What are you?" he asked, and it was the second time in Thanos' long life that he had asked that question, and genuinely did not have a preliminary answer waiting. Tony Stark, watching from above with every sensor his suit possessed still locked on the two figures below, heard the exchange through his audio pickup and felt the readouts from Saitama's biometrics confirm what his eyes were already telling him. No elevated heart rate, no cortisol spike, no adrenaline. Biologically, Saitama was responding to a direct full-force strike from Thanos the way a resting person responds to sitting in a chair. Tony pulled the analysis from the sword impact. The force Thanos had put into that blow was a number his system had a reference for because he had modeled Thanos' physical output during the Titan engagement. He compared that number to Saitama's biometric response, found the comparison produced a ratio that his system rendered in scientific notation because the regular number was too large to display cleanly, and then sat with that ratio for a moment before deciding the only honest thing to say about it. He opened the command channel. "Guys," he said, "I think we brought a man to a god fight, and it turns out the man is the god." Thanos had not received an answer to his question. Saitama had looked at him for a moment after he asked it, and the look was not evasive or mysterious or calculated. It was the look of someone who found the question mildly interesting but didn't have a satisfying answer to give. "I'm a hero," Saitama said finally. "For fun." He said it the way someone states their occupation at a party when they don't particularly want to talk about work, factually and without elaboration. And then he looked past Thanos at the battle still unfolding around them, as if checking whether the situation had developed while he was engaged in this conversation. Thanos followed his gaze for one moment, then returned his full attention to Saitama, and made the assessment that a being of his experience and intelligence makes when the data is unambiguous, even if the conclusion is uncomfortable. The man in front of him was not a strategic problem. He was not an obstacle to be rooted around or a variable to be neutralized through superior firepower. He was something Thanos had not encountered in 500 years of remaking the universe according to his vision, and the recognition of what that meant for the plan he had spent those 500 years constructing arrived in his mind, with the cold, clear precision of a mathematical proof reaching its final line. He tightened his grip on his sword and said nothing for a long moment, because there was nothing tactically useful to say, and Thanos had always been a being who preferred useful speech to honest speech when the two were in conflict. The two were in conflict now. Thanos did not commit to a second strike immediately, and the fact that he didn't was itself the most significant event that had occurred on the battlefield since the warship appeared above the compound. Every Avenger who had ever faced him, every strategist who had studied the pattern of his engagements across the galaxy, every record compiled from the survivors of worlds he had visited understood that Thanos' defining tactical characteristic was forward pressure. He moved through opposition the way geological forces move through landscape, not by choosing the path of least resistance, but by applying enough consistent force that resistance became irrelevant as a category. He had never needed to pause and recalibrate against a direct physical opponent, because no direct physical opponent had ever given him a reason to. The pause lasted 4 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than anything on this battlefield had managed to produce in him, and then he moved again, not with the single committed strike of the opening blow, but with a sequence, a combination drawn from centuries of close combat against opponents powerful enough that single strikes had occasionally been insufficient. The combination was technically extraordinary. Each element was designed to build on the previous one, the sword creating angles that the follow-through of his body weight was designed to exploit, the whole sequence generating a cascading structural pressure that had dismantled the defensive capacity of every opponent he had ever applied it to regardless of their individual strength, because the sequence wasn't designed to overpower. It was designed to find and leverage the inevitable gaps that appear in any defensive structure under sustained directional pressure. It was the combat knowledge of 5 centuries compressed into 10 seconds of applied geometry, and it connected with Saitama repeatedly across those 10 seconds, and Saitama received it the way a cliff receives a wave completely, without adjustment, without the sequence finding any gap to exploit because there was no defensive structure to find gaps in. He wasn't defending. He was just there, and the sequence landed against him and concluded, and he was still just there in the same posture, looking at Thanos with the mildly interested expression of someone who has just watched a capable person do something impressive without being personally affected by it. The ground around them told the story more clearly than anything else. Every impact had transferred its energy somewhere, and the somewhere was the earth beneath and around the engagement, which was fractured in a radius of 40 meters in every direction from where they stood, cracked in deep geometric patterns that corresponded to the force vectors of Thanos' strikes. The energy had gone into the ground because it had nowhere else to go. Saitama's body had not accepted it, and the environment had been forced to absorb it instead, and the result was a crater forming under their feet without either of them being visibly diminished by the process. Thor, watching from a position 80 meters back, had seen this phenomenon once before, not in combat but in the old stories, the ones that predated Asgard's written records, the ones passed down in the oral tradition of beings who were old when Odin was young. The stories described a category of existence that operated outside the power systems everything else ran on, something the ancient framework called a singularity of will, a being whose strength was not sourced from energy or biology or cosmic endowment, but from something that didn't have a name because it predated the concept of naming. He had always assumed those stories were mythological in the way that the most extreme stories always are, true in principle and exaggerated in detail. He was no longer assuming that. Thanos stepped back. The step was small and it was controlled, and it was the kind of movement a combatant makes when they are repositioning rather than retreating. But it was backward, and it was deliberate, and it was the first time in the memory of anyone alive that Thanos had taken a step away from an opponent he was actively engaging. He brought the gauntlet hand forward, and the stones on it flared, not all of them, not the full combined deployment he had been holding in reserve for the moment the gauntlet transfer became critical, but the power stone alone, channeled through the gauntlet's focusing architecture, and directed in a concentrated beam at Saitama's position, with the full amplification of one of the 6 fundamental forces of the universe behind it. The power stone's energy hit Saitama, and the light was total, and the sound was a physical event that knocked outriders off their feet 200 meters in every direction. The beam held for 3 seconds, which was longer than Thanos had ever needed to sustain it against any target, because 3 seconds of concentrated power stone energy at full gauntlet amplification was an amount of force measured in the output of small stars. When he released it, the smoke and light took a moment to resolve, and every set of eyes on the battlefield that was oriented in that direction was waiting for the result with the specific collective tension of people who understood that what they were about to see would define the remainder of the engagement. The smoke cleared. Saitama was standing in a shallow depression where the energy had pushed the earth down around his feet. His suit had a scorch mark on the left shoulder, the kind of mark that appears when something very hot passes close enough to affect the surface material without penetrating it. He was looking down at the scorch mark with an expression that was less concern and more mild annoyance, the way someone looks at a shirt they've gotten a small stain on. He brushed at it once with his other hand, found it didn't come off, and looked up at Thanos. His expression had not changed in any fundamental way, but there was something new in it, not anger, not aggression, but the specific quality of attention that appears when someone who has been passively observing a situation decides they have observed it long enough to reach a conclusion. He had been letting this happen. That was the thing that none of the Avengers watching had fully processed yet, and the thing that Thanos was processing right now in real time, with the full weight of his intelligence applied to it. The man in the yellow suit had been receiving everything thrown at him, with the passive tolerance of someone waiting to see the full extent of what the other party had to offer. He had not yet decided to end the engagement. He had been deciding whether to. Saitama looked at the scorch mark one more time and then looked at Thanos and said, in a tone of voice that was conversational rather than threatening, but contained a quality of finality that had nothing to do with volume, "Okay, my turn." The Avengers had seen a lot of things in the collective span of their experience that had redefined what they thought the word powerful could contain. They had seen a purple titan rearrange reality with a closed fist. They had seen a man made of lightning split the sky over a battlefield and call it down on an army. They had seen a teenager catch a weapon designed to level mountains and hold it in place with one hand while making a joke about it. They had seen the Hulk, which was its own category of reference point that most of them still hadn't fully integrated into their baseline understanding of what physical force looked like at its upper limit. Each of those things had expanded the envelope of what they understood to be possible, and each expansion had eventually been absorbed into the working model they used to navigate a world where the extraordinary was, at this point, essentially, the professional norm. What they were about to see did not expand the envelope. It made the envelope irrelevant as a concept. Saitama drew his fist back. The motion was simple and it was slow, and it was the kind of movement a person makes when they are not in a hurry because they have no reason to be in a hurry. The casual, unhurried preparation of someone performing a task that does not require urgency. There was no energy gathering, no visible accumulation of power around his fist, no crackling field, no luminescence, no atmospheric disturbance of the kind that precedes every significant energy event in this universe, because in this universe power announces itself. The air around Tony Stark's suit registered a pressure drop of the kind that precedes very large events the way a sudden silence precedes a very large sound, and Tony had exactly enough time to register that reading before Saitama completed the motion, and the fist connected with Thanos. The word connected was doing considerable work in that sentence and was not fully equal to the task. What happened at the point of contact between Saitama's fist and Thanos' body was not a transfer of force in any sense that the physics of this universe had a complete accounting for. It was, at its most literal, a fist hitting a body, and the body went. The direction it went was backward, and the speed at which it went was a number that Tony's suit attempted to calculate from the sensor data, and returned as a percentage of the speed of light that made Tony say a word out loud inside his helmet that he hadn't said since the first time he'd seen the footage of the original snap. Thanos crossed the battlefield in a fraction of a second, and the far edge of the engagement space had a wall of compressed earth along it that the warship's positioning system had generated as a defensive perimeter. And Thanos hit that wall, and the wall stopped being a wall and became a memory of a wall and a large quantity of airborne debris. The ground between where the punch had landed and where Thanos had come to rest was a furrow a meter deep and 40 meters long, plowed into the earth by the passage of his body through it at a velocity the earth had not been designed to accommodate. The battlefield went quiet, not strategically quiet, not the tactical quiet of two sides pausing to reassess, genuinely, completely, and involuntarily quiet, because every living thing on that field had just received the same simultaneous input, and the processing of that input required a brief suspension of all other activity. The Outrider army, which had continued its engagement across every other sector of the battle through everything else that had happened, stopped. Not in response to a command, not because a strategic directive had been issued. They stopped the way a system stops when the central process it's running crashes and everything downstream of it freezes, because the central process of the Outrider army was ultimately Thanos' will, and Thanos' will had just been interrupted in a way that didn't have a protocol. Thor broke the silence first, not with words but with a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a stunned exhale, the specific sound a person makes when something happens that bypasses the part of the brain that generates considered responses and goes straight to the part that just reacts. Steve Rogers lowered his shield by approximately 3 inches, which was not a conscious decision, but a physical response to the temporary suspension of the immediate threat that his body made before his mind had finished catching up. Rhodey, still airborne, listed slightly to the left in his hover pattern in the way War Machine did when its pilot had just experienced a significant neurological distraction. Bruce Banner said, "Huh," in a tone that compressed several weeks of scientific reconsideration into a single syllable. Tony said nothing, because Tony was looking at the sensor data from the punch, and the sensor data from the punch had caused his suit's analytical system to do something it had never done in any combat environment across all the years, and all the impossible things he had pointed it at. The system had simply stopped trying to generate a classification for what it had just measured. It had not returned an error. It had not flagged the data as corrupted. It had apparently made an internal decision that the most accurate thing it could do with the information it had received was decline to characterize it, and it had produced a blank field where the impact analysis would normally appear, and below the blank field in the system's own notation language, it had written two characters that Tony had built into the system years ago as a catch-all for situations where the data exceeded the available framework. The two characters were N.A. Thanos was not destroyed. That was the next thing the battlefield processed, filtering through in the second and third beats after the initial silence, as the dust at the far end of the furrow began to shift and the shape inside it began to resolve. He had not been erased, had not been reduced, had not been ended in the way that the sheer magnitude of what had just happened seemed to imply was the only proportionate outcome. He was moving. Slowly, but moving. The way something immensely durable moves when it has been subjected to a force beyond its tolerance, and its fundamental structural integrity is asserting itself in spite of the damage, because the structural integrity of Thanos was also extraordinary, was also a thing that had been built and tested across centuries, and it was doing its job now in the face of the worst input it had ever received. He got one knee under himself and his hand pressed into the earth, and the gauntlet scraped against the soil and the stones in it flickered. And the sight of those stones flickering was the thing that snapped the battlefield back into motion, because the stones were still there, and the stones were still the whole point. Saitama stood at the origin point of the punch and looked at the distant shape of Thanos slowly recovering, and seemed to be performing a quiet internal assessment of the result. His expression indicated the assessment was generating a familiar conclusion. Familiar in the specific sense of a conclusion he had reached many times before in many different contexts and had never fully made peace with. He had hit something as hard as he could hit it, which was the only setting he had access to, and the thing had not ended. This was not surprising to him. Almost nothing ended from the hardest hit he could deliver, and the reason for this had occupied a small, sad corner of his inner life for longer than he cared to think about. But the thing about the reason was that it had always been true in his own universe, where the upper limit of what existed was calibrated to the upper limit of what he could do. He was looking at it being true here, in a universe that had not been calibrated to him at all, against an opponent who was genuinely extraordinary by any standard his own world contained, and the familiar conclusion was arriving with the familiar weight. He had hit Thanos as hard as he could hit anything, and Thanos was getting back up, not unharmed, not unchanged. The damage was evident and real, and the recovery was slow in a way that Thanos' recovery had never been slow in any engagement anyone here had witnessed. But getting up. Saitama watched him and was quiet for a moment and then said, to the general space around him rather than to anyone specific, "He's pretty tough." Thanos rose from the furrow with the deliberate, grinding effort of a structure reasserting itself after catastrophic loading, not the fluid recovery of a fighter who has absorbed a manageable blow and is resetting, but the fundamental, load-bearing effort of something massive that has been pushed past its design limits and is rebuilding the architecture of its own function from the ground up. Every Avenger on the field who had seen him fight before, who had watched him take Stormbreaker through the chest on Titan and keep moving, who had cataloged the specific quality of his physical invulnerability as one of the fixed reference points of the engagement, was watching that reference point revise itself in real time. The damage was different in kind from anything he had absorbed before. His armor was compromised across the left side, in a way that the metal itself seemed uncertain about, the structural deformation following a pattern that didn't correspond to impact geometry, because the geometry of what had hit him didn't correspond to anything in the material's experience. His gauntlet hand was pressed flat against the earth, and the stones in it were doing something none of the Avengers had seen them do under his control. They were fluctuating independently. The 6 stones had always operated as a unified system under Thanos' direction. Even when he used them individually, there was a coherence to the gauntlet's energy state, a sense of controlled potential, like pressure contained in a system that knew exactly how much it held and where it was going. What Tony's sensors were reading now was not a controlled system. The stones were cycling through activation states without apparent direction, each one spiking and dimming on its own rhythm, the collective output of the gauntlet producing a field that was doing measurable things to the local environment without being aimed at anything. The reality stone's fluctuation was bending light in a 20-meter radius around Thanos' position, making the air look like heat shimmer over asphalt on a summer road. The space stone was producing small, unstable microapertures in the fabric of local space that opened and closed in fractions of a second, each one releasing a pressure burst that displaced air and debris in random directions. The time stone was generating a localized temporal echo effect that Tony's suit detected as a 3-frame visual stutter in everything within its radius, the universe briefly showing multiple versions of each moment simultaneously before resolving back to one. What was happening, Tony understood within 30 seconds of reading the data, was that the punch had done something to the gauntlet that Thanos' physical recovery didn't address. The force that had passed through Thanos had also passed through the gauntlet, and the gauntlet was a focusing instrument built to channel the energy of the stones. It was not built to receive the kind of input it had just received, and the stones, which were not passive objects but fundamental forces with their own inherent behaviors, were responding to the disruption of their containment architecture by doing what fundamental forces do when the structure directing them is compromised. They were expressing themselves without direction, and 6 fundamental forces of the universe expressing themselves without direction in close proximity to each other, and to a battlefield full of living beings, was a situation that needed to be classified as a new category of urgent. Bruce Banner reached the same conclusion from his position and was already moving before Tony finished forming the thought. "The gauntlet is destabilized," Bruce said on the command channel, his voice carrying the specific controlled urgency of a scientist who has identified an extremely dangerous thing and is being professional about it. "If those fluctuations synchronize, the combined output could—" He paused, not for effect, but because the end of that sentence was something he needed to be accurate about. "Could affect everything in a significant radius. The time and reality fluctuations alone interacting with each other produce outcomes I can't fully model." "How significant a radius?" Tony asked. "Bruce." "Significant," Bruce said. "I'm not being evasive. I genuinely cannot put a clean number on it because the interaction of destabilized stone energy at this proximity has never been observed. Theoretically, and I want to be clear that this is theoretical, it could be continental." The word continental sat on the command channel for a moment with the specific weight of information that changes the nature of the conversation it arrives in. Steve Rogers heard it and looked at the fluctuating field around Thanos' recovering position, and then looked at Saitama, who was standing 40 meters from the epicenter of the fluctuation event, and appeared to be watching it with the mild, curious attention of someone observing an unfamiliar weather phenomenon. He had not moved back from it. He had not assessed it as a threat requiring a response. He was simply watching it the way he watched everything else on this field, as an interesting development in a situation that had produced several interesting developments already. Thanos got fully upright. The process of doing so took longer than anything had ever taken him, and when he reached full height, the difference in his bearing from earlier in the battle was visible even at distance. A quality of controlled impairment, like an engine running on reduced capacity that is working very hard to perform at a level that masks the reduction. He looked at the gauntlet and the fluctuating stones, and his face showed something that the Avengers had never seen on it in any engagement across any timeline. It showed calculation that contained uncertainty, and uncertainty in Thanos' face was as foreign as snow on the surface of the sun. He understood what the destabilization meant. He had built the gauntlet with the foreknowledge of what these stones were capable of when properly contained, which meant he understood what they were capable of when the containment was wrong. He looked from the gauntlet to Saitama, and the calculation in his face shifted into a different register. Not the assessment of an opponent to be overcome, but the assessment of a factor to be incorporated into a rapidly changing equation. He made a decision that no model of his behavior that any Avenger had ever constructed would have predicted. He deployed the Time Stone, not as a weapon, not directed at Saitama, but inward, focused on the gauntlet itself, attempting to stabilize the fluctuation by returning the instrument to a prior state before the damage had propagated through its structure. It was a defensive application of a stone he had only ever used offensively, and it was the choice of someone who has identified that the immediate threat is no longer the opponent in front of them, but the system they are carrying. The Time Stone's energy flared green and gold across the gauntlet, and the fluctuations began to slow, the other stones' independent cycling coming under the influence of the temporal stabilization, the reality bends and space microapertures reducing in frequency. He was pulling the situation back from the continental edge, but the process of doing it required his complete and divided attention, which meant that, for the first time since the battle began, Thanos was not looking at Saitama. Tony recognized the window before anyone else. "The gauntlet transfer," he said on the command channel. "Right now, he cannot engage and stabilize simultaneously. This is the window." The channel erupted into coordinated movement. The relay chain that had been interrupted when Thanos changed his vector reformed with the desperate speed of people who understood that windows of this kind have a fixed duration and no guarantee of reopening. But the window's existence depended on one assumption that Tony had not fully examined before he called it, which was that Thanos would remain divided for long enough for the transfer to complete. And the reason that assumption was uncertain was standing 40 meters from Thanos, watching the Time Stone stabilization with the focused, evaluating attention of someone who had just seen something that had given them a new thought, and whose new thoughts had so far proven to be the most consequential events on this battlefield. Saitama looked at the gauntlet. He looked at the stones. He looked at Thanos, bent to the task of stabilization with everything he had. And then he looked at his own fist slowly, the way a craftsman looks at a tool after using it and noticing something about the result that they want to understand better. He was thinking about something. Nobody on the field knew what, and nobody on the field had yet developed the framework to predict what a man like Saitama thinks when he is given a moment of stillness in the middle of everything. The gauntlet transfer was moving. That was the operative fact underneath everything else happening on the field in this moment, the load-bearing truth that the Avengers' entire remaining strategic architecture was built on. The relay chain had reformed with the speed of people who had trained for exactly this kind of compressed, high-stakes handoff. Not the specific scenario. Nobody had trained for the specific scenario because the specific scenario had not been imaginable 20 minutes ago. But the fundamental physical and tactical discipline of moving a critical object across a contested space under pressure while maintaining defensive coverage of the carrier. They were good at this. They had always been good at this. The problem was that the contested space had become significantly more complicated than any version of it they had modeled, because the destabilized stones were still producing environmental effects even under Thanos' stabilization effort. And those effects were doing things to the field that the relay chain's members were having to navigate in real time without reference points. The reality stone's residual fluctuation was the most immediately disruptive. Even partially stabilized, it was producing localized shifts in the physical environment that were not dramatic enough to constitute full reality alteration, but were significant enough to make the ground unpredictable, surfaces that had been solid becoming briefly soft, the trajectory of debris shifting mid-arc, the space between 2 points occasionally behaving as though the distance were different from what it visually appeared to be. Scott Lang, moving in a compressed-size state through the outer edge of the reality stone's influence radius, experienced a 30-foot gap between two positions become briefly a 300-foot gap, and then snap back in the time it took him to cross it. arriving at his destination with the disoriented expression of someone whose internal spatial model has just been briefly and completely wrong. Nebula, running the interior of the relay path, found two separate moments where the ground she was about to step onto wasn't where her foot expected it, and corrected both times with the reflexive precision of someone who has spent her life making adjustments to physical reality with prosthetic systems, but corrected them harder and closer than comfortable. The transfer was moving, but it was moving through a field that was actively working against it in ways that were not coordinated or intentional, but were in some ways more dangerous for that. Random interference is harder to anticipate than directed opposition, because anticipation requires a pattern and random events, by definition, don't provide one. Tony was tracking the relay from above, feeding position updates and field condition alerts into the team's shared tactical channel, and the picture his sensors were assembling of the gauntlet's progress was one of sustained, grinding, improvised forward motion through a constantly shifting obstacle set. They were making it work. They were making it work the way things get made to work when the people doing it are extraordinary and committed, and have no alternative through will and adaptability, and the refusal to accept that the obstacles are definitional rather than situational. But the margin was narrow, and it was getting narrower as the stabilization Thanos was performing on the gauntlet reached a threshold, and the stone's fluctuation decreased enough that he was able to redirect a fraction of his attention outward again. He saw the relay chain. The calculation in his face completed itself in the space of 1 second, and then he moved not toward Saitama, not toward the relay chain directly, but toward a position that his tactical geometry identified as the point where interdicting the transfer would be most efficient, a choke point in the relay path that the chain's current trajectory had to pass through. He was compromised, was moving at reduced capacity compared to his peak, was managing the gauntlet's stabilization simultaneously with physical engagement, and he was still the most dangerous non-Saitama entity on the battlefield, because that was how extreme the baseline was. War Machine moved to intercept the interception, and the exchange between them was brief and decisive in Thanos' favor, Rhodes going down hard and fast, and the suit's emergency systems broadcasting his status as damaged but breathing, and the choke point opened up. Saitama watched this sequence happen. He had been standing in approximate stillness since his punch had landed, not disengaged but present in the way. He was always present, observing, processing in whatever way Saitama processed things, arriving at conclusions through a mechanism that nobody on this field had the framework to map. He had watched the gauntlet transfer form and begin moving. He had watched the relay chain navigate the reality stone's interference. He had watched Rhodes go down and the choke point open. And somewhere in the observation of these sequential events, the thought he had been forming since he looked at his own fist had finished forming, and it had produced a conclusion. And the conclusion was the kind of simple, practical, slightly obvious conclusion that Saitama reliably arrived at when complex situations were presented to him, without the framework of heroic tradition telling him what the conclusion was supposed to be. The conclusion was, the stones were the problem, not Thanos as a physical opponent, not the army, not the tactical complexity of the field. The stones. Everything that had happened on this field, everything that had happened 5 years ago when half of everything stopped existing, everything that was happening now with the destabilized gauntlet and the fluctuating reality and the relay chain risking lives to move an object across a contested space, all of it was the stones. And if the stones were the problem, the solution was to address the stones, and addressing the stones was, from a purely physical standpoint, a simpler problem than anyone else on this field was treating it, as because everyone else on this field was approaching it through the framework of what the stones were supposed to be capable of doing to someone who tried to address them directly without a containment system. Saitama did not have a containment system. What he had was a fist, and a working model, recently confirmed, of what that fist could do to things that were supposed to be beyond the reach of any force that existed. He began walking toward Thanos, not toward the relay chain, not toward the choke point, not toward the tactically optimal position that any of the Avengers' strategic models would have identified. Directly toward Thanos, through the residual reality stone interference, over the broken ground, with the same unhurried walking pace he had maintained since the moment he appeared on this field. Tony saw the vector on his sensors and understood the intent before Saitama had closed half the distance, and the understanding produced a reaction that was half tactical alarm and half something that, in a different context, might have been called hope. Because the intent was insane, and it was also the only remaining play that the field's current geometry actually supported. "He's going for the gauntlet," Tony said on the channel. The channel was quiet for one beat. Then Steve said, "Can he survive touching all 6 stones simultaneously?" Tony looked at his sensor data, at the measurements of the power stone beam that had produced a scorch mark on a yellow suit, at the impact analysis of Thanos' full-force sword strike that had transferred entirely into the earth beneath Saitama's feet, at the blank in a field where the punch's force measurement should have been. He thought about what it meant that the universe's fundamental forces had a complex and measurable relationship with physical matter, and then he thought about what it meant that Saitama's relationship to physical matter appeared to operate outside the framework that relationship was built on. "I don't know," Tony said honestly. "I don't think the question means the same thing for him that it means for everyone else." Another beat of quiet. Then Bruce said, "That's either the most reassuring thing I've ever heard or the most terrifying." "Yeah," Tony said, "I know." Saitama reached Thanos. Thanos turned from the choke point to face him, the gauntlet raised, the stones still cycling through their partially stabilized states, and looked at the man in the yellow suit approaching him with the expression of someone who has been expecting a continuation of an earlier conversation and is preparing for it with everything they have left. He said nothing. He deployed the power stone again, full force, full gauntlet amplification, directed at point-blank range. The light was absolute and the sound was the sound of a small star making a decision. When it cleared, Saitama was 2 steps closer than he had been, and his suit had 3 scorch marks now, and his expression was the same as it had been since the beginning, mild and present and entirely unimpressed by what had just been pointed at him. He looked at the gauntlet from 2 meters away. He looked at the stones in it, cycling and fluctuating, each one a fundamental force of reality packaged into a crystal and focused through an instrument built to give one being control over all of them. He reached out. He took hold of the gauntlet, his bare hand closing around the chassis between the power and space stone settings, and the stone's reaction to the contact was immediate and total, and was not the reaction anyone on the field had predicted. They went quiet. The silence from the stones lasted 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds the entire battlefield operated on a kind of held collective breath that had nothing to do with tactical awareness or survival instinct, and everything to do with the specific human and non-human response to witnessing something that has no category. The stones had never been quiet. From the moment the first stone had been excavated from its resting place in the ancient history of this universe, every record, every account, every scar left on civilizations that had encountered them described the same fundamental characteristic: presence. The stones were not passive. They were not inert crystals that waited for direction. They were fundamental forces that had been compressed into physical form, and compression does not eliminate nature. It concentrates it, and concentrated nature pushes back against everything around it continuously, the way pressure in a sealed system expresses itself through every available surface all the time. The fluctuations, the energy fields, the environmental distortions, those were not malfunctions or side effects. They were the stones being what they were. They did not stop being what they were for anyone. They had not stopped for Thanos, whose grip on them through the gauntlet was total and had been total for years. They stopped now, in the 3 seconds after Saitama's hand closed around the gauntlet chassis, And the stopping was not the silence of suppression or containment. It was the silence of recognition. Tony's sensors recorded it as a complete cessation of the gauntlet's energy output. Not a reduction, not a dampening, a cessation. The kind of flatline reading his system associated with objects that were powered down or destroyed. The stones were still there. His optical sensors confirmed them visually, sitting in the gauntlet's chassis with their internal luminescence reduced to the absolute baseline glow that indicated they were intact and functional. They had not been neutralized. They had not been drained. They had simply stopped expressing outward force in any direction, which was a thing that had never happened before in the recorded history of any of them, and which his analytical system had no framework for because the frameworks were all built on the foundational assumption that the stones did not stop unless they were physically separated from each other and isolated, which they hadn't been. They were all still there, in the gauntlet in Thanos' hand, with another hand wrapped around the chassis from outside, and they were quiet. Thanos felt it through the gauntlet with a clarity that bypassed every layer of philosophical certainty he had built over 5 centuries, and reached something underneath all of it, something old and unguarded that had not been accessed in a very long time. The stones communicated to their wielder through the gauntlet in ways that were not language and not imagery, but something more primary than either. A direct impression of state that the wielder received as knowledge without the intermediate step of information processing. What he received in this moment was not a communication of threat or conflict or competing will. It was something his mind translated, inadequately, as deference. The stones, which had pushed back against every hand that had ever touched them, including his own, which had burned through lesser beings who attempted contact, which had resisted and tested, and asserted their nature against the architecture of the gauntlet itself even as they operated within it, were in the presence of Saitama's contact doing something that Thanos had no word for because nothing in his experience had required the word. They were waiting, not suppressed, not controlled. Waiting, the way things wait when they have encountered something they have decided to be still for. He released the gauntlet. The release was not tactical, and it was not surrender in any conventional sense. It was the response of a being whose framework for understanding what was happening had just collapsed past the point where holding on was a meaningful action. His hand opened, and the gauntlet remained in contact with Saitama's grip, and Thanos stepped back one step, the expression on his face something that the Avengers watching from across the field would later struggle to describe accurately, because it didn't map cleanly onto any of the categories of expression they associated with him. It was not defeat. It was not rage. It was the expression of someone who has spent their entire existence building a structure of meaning around a set of assumptions, and has just encountered incontrovertible evidence that one of the foundational assumptions is wrong. The stones, which Thanos had believed were the ultimate authority, the final arbiters of what was possible in this universe, the instruments through which any will sufficiently strong could reshape reality itself, had just demonstrated that there existed something relative to which their authority was not ultimate. He had known the stones were powerful. He had not known the stones could recognize something they considered to be in a category above themselves, because he had not known such a category existed. Saitama looked at the gauntlet in his hand. He turned it over once, examining it the way he had examined the piece of debris earlier, with genuine but limited curiosity, the attention of someone who finds an object interesting without necessarily wanting to keep it. The stones sat quietly in their settings, luminescent and still, and the environmental effects that had been emanating from the gauntlet's destabilized state had completely ceased. The reality stone's interference field collapsed. The space stone's micro-apertures closed. The time stone's temporal echo resolved back to a single present moment. The battlefield, which had been navigating all of those effects simultaneously, became suddenly and completely normal in its physical behavior for the first time since the battle began, and the normality was almost disorienting after what had preceded it. Steve Rogers arrived at Saitama's position 30 seconds later, having crossed the field at a run, the moment the gauntlet's energy signature went flat on Tony's sensors. He arrived slightly out of breath, which was the closest Steve Rogers got to showing physical exertion, and looked at Saitama holding the gauntlet, and looked at Thanos standing 2 meters away, and looked at the stones sitting quietly in their settings as if they were decorative elements in a piece of jewelry rather than 6 fundamental forces of the universe. He took all of this in and then looked at Saitama and said, with the careful precision of someone who wants to ask the right question the first time, "Did you know that would happen?" Saitama considered the question seriously. "No," he said, "I just grabbed it." Steve absorbed this. "Can you?" he began and stopped and started again. "The stones. We need to use them to undo what was done, to bring everyone back." "Can you?" He didn't know exactly how to complete the sentence because the sentence required a framework he didn't have yet for what Saitama could and couldn't do, and the last several minutes had demonstrated that the framework he'd had before was insufficient. Saitama looked at the gauntlet. He looked at Steve. "What do I do?" he asked. Tony landed beside them at that moment, the suit's faceplate opening as he touched down, and his face was doing several things simultaneously. The focused urgency of the tactical moment, the deep running exhaustion of the battle, and underneath both of those something that might have been the expression of a man who has just encountered the edges of everything he thought he knew, and is in the early stages of deciding how he feels about finding them. He looked at Saitama holding the gauntlet and the quiet stones and Thanos standing apart and the battlefield around them that was entering a state of tentative, fragile pause as the Outrider army processed the absence of the directional will that had been coordinating it. "The snap," Tony said. "One snap with all 6 stones engaged simultaneously with the intent to restore everyone who was lost. That's all it takes. The stones, they respond to will, to intent. You just have to." He stopped. He looked at the gauntlet and then at Saitama and finished the sentence differently than he had planned to. "You just have to want it." Saitama looked at the gauntlet for a long moment. He thought about half of everything stopping. He thought about 5 years of absence and the weight of that absence on the people standing around him. People he had known for less than an hour, but whose exhaustion and grief were legible even to someone who didn't naturally read those frequencies easily. He thought about it in the simple, practical way he thought about everything, not in terms of cosmic significance or historical weight, but in terms of what the situation was and what the situation needed. He closed the gauntlet's fingers into a fist around his own hand, the stones flaring back to full luminescence as the intent formed, all 6 simultaneously, the combined light of them casting the entire battlefield in a composite glow that had no color analog in normal experience. Thanos saw it from 2 meters away and said nothing. He had said everything available to him. The stones had already given their answer. The snap was quiet. One sound, small and clean, lasting a fraction of a second. And then the light was everywhere, and the wind moved across the battlefield carrying something that was not atmospheric in origin, and across the universe the absence that had persisted for 5 years began, in the space of a breath, to fill. Saitama lowered his hand. He looked at the gauntlet. He looked at his hand. He looked at the slowly brightening battlefield as the return began to arrive, the portals opening not from a coordinated effort this time, but from the simple consequence of existence reasserting itself where it had been interrupted. He watched it all for a moment, and then he looked at the gauntlet one more time, and then he looked at Tony and held it out to him, the way someone hands back a tool they borrowed and are now done with. "Here," he said. Tony looked at the gauntlet and then at Saitama and then at the gauntlet again. He took it slowly. He held it and looked at it for a long moment. You just used the Infinity Gauntlet," Tony said. Saitama nodded. "Yeah," he said. He paused. "Is that bad?" The world that existed on the other side of the snap was not the world that had existed before it. That was the first thing that became clear in the hours following the battle, as the immediate tactical situation resolved itself into something resembling stillness, and the people who had been fighting for their lives began the slower, more complicated process of understanding what had just happened and what it meant for everything that came next. The returned were back. That was real. That was confirmed. The absence that had defined 5 years of collective grief and reconstruction had been filled in a single moment by a man who had held the 6 fundamental forces of the universe in one hand and found the experience roughly equivalent in effort to opening a jar. The battle was over. Thanos' army, coherence gone with the fracturing of his intent and the irreversible loss of the gauntlet, had dispersed in the way that mechanisms disperse when the central process driving them is interrupted beyond recovery. Thanos himself had withdrawn, not dramatically, not with a speech or a final declaration, simply withdrawn, walking away from the battlefield with the measured pace of someone whose relationship with a thing they have spent their life building has just fundamentally changed, and who needs distance from the sight of that change before they can think clearly. Nobody stopped him. Nobody had a ready framework for what stopping him now meant, in a world where the gauntlet was no longer his, and the plan it was built to complete had been undone in the same moment it was being executed. Tony Stark spent the first 3 hours after the battle running analyses he knew before he started would not produce satisfying conclusions. The gauntlet data, the stone's behavior during Saitama's contact, the snap's energy signature, the biometric readings from the entire engagement. He processed all of it and arrived at the same place each time, which was a border past which his framework simply did not extend. The stones had quieted for Saitama. That was a fact. The fact had no explanation that fit inside any model Tony could build because every model he could build was constructed from assumptions that Saitama's existence violated at the foundational level. He was not enhanced. He was not cosmic. He was not empowered by a stone, a serum, a suit, a god lineage, or any other mechanism Tony could identify. He was a man from a city that didn't appear on any map in any database Tony had access to, who had trained until something in him, something that his biology showed no evidence of, and his history provided no account of, had become absolute. And the universe, including the parts of it that were supposed to be the final authority on what was possible, had recognized the absoluteness and responded to it accordingly. Tony wrote up his analysis, and at the end of it typed a single line that he had never typed at the end of any analysis in his career. I don't know. He stared at it for a long time and then left it there, because honesty about the edges of knowledge was the only intellectually defensible position, and Tony Stark had always, underneath everything else, been someone who preferred the defensible position. Thor found Saitama sitting on a piece of collapsed wall at the edge of the compound's ruins, eating something he had apparently retrieved from a supply cache somewhere in the remaining structure. A piece of bread and what appeared to be a can of something, consumed with the focused, appreciative attention of someone who had missed a meal and is now correcting that. Thor sat beside him, which required a moment of structural assessment of the wall's remaining load capacity, and said nothing for a while, which for Thor was itself a significant communication. He had spent a lot of his long life in the company of powerful beings, and had developed a sense for what they needed from silence versus what they needed from words. Saitama, he had concluded, needed neither in any particular way. He was simply present, in the way he was always present, eating his bread and looking at the battlefield with the mild, observational gaze of a man watching weather from a window. "You saved them," Thor said eventually, because it was true and because sometimes the true thing was the only thing worth saying. Saitama chewed. "I just grabbed the glove," he said, and snapped. Thor looked at the horizon. "Yes," he said. That's what saving them looked like. Saitama considered this and seemed to find it neither satisfying nor unsatisfying, just accurate in the way that true things are accurate. The question of who Saitama was and where he had come from became, within 48 hours of the battle's end, something considerably larger than an internal Avengers inquiry. The battlefield had been witnessed. The returned were back and grateful and talking, and the world that received them was a world that had been in the process of rebuilding its own shattered sense of normalcy for 5 years, and was now being asked to absorb simultaneously the return of half its population, and the news that the battle that secured it had involved an unknown man in a yellow suit who had physically outmatched Thanos, quieted the Infinity Stones by touching them, and used the gauntlet to restore universal balance with less apparent effort than the act of clapping. The footage existed. Tony's sensor data, the battlefield recordings from multiple sources, the accounts of every Avenger who had been present, it all existed, and it all said the same thing. And the same thing was not something the world's existing frameworks for understanding extraordinary human capacity were equipped to absorb cleanly. The governments that had been managing the post-snap world, the intelligence agencies that had cataloged every known enhanced individual, the academic institutions that had spent 5 years developing theoretical models for the power systems involved in both the original snap and the battle, all of them received the information, and all of them began the same process of trying to fit it into something they could work with, and all of them arrived at the same border Tony had arrived at. There was no file for Saitama. There was no origin story that fit the evidence. There was no power system that accounted for what the sensors had recorded. The man existed outside every taxonomy they had for extraordinary human beings, and the taxonomies were extensive, and the people maintaining them were very good at their jobs, and the failure of the taxonomies was therefore not a procedural failure but a structural one. The structure itself was insufficient for the fact it was being asked to contain. Saitama, during all of this, was trying to find a way home. This was his primary preoccupation in the days following the battle, and it coexisted with the world's growing awareness of him, the way the concerns of a person trying to find their car in an unfamiliar city coexist with the fact that they have just accidentally won a parade, present, real, and entirely uncorrelated. He asked Tony about the portal that had brought him here. Tony traced the time travel mechanism that had generated the convergence event and found that the specific aperture that had deposited Saitama on the field had been a dimensional bleed rather than a temporal one, a point where the boundary between adjacent universe states had thinned to the point of passage, and that reopening it was theoretically possible, but required resources and time that the current state of the compound's infrastructure could not immediately provide. He told Saitama this as straightforwardly as he could, and Saitama listened and nodded and asked the single most practical follow-up question available to him. How long? Tony thought about it honestly. Weeks, he said. Maybe more. Saitama processed this. Is there a grocery store nearby? He asked. Tony stared at him. I'll have someone show you, he said. What the world inherited from the battle was not a new hero. Saitama never agreed to that category, and the category never quite fit him regardless. What the world inherited was a permanent revision of its understanding of what could exist, not as mythology or theoretical physics, but as demonstrated, recorded, multiply-witnessed fact. There was a man who had hit Thanos so hard the gauntlet had destabilized. There was a man in whose presence the Infinity Stones had chosen stillness. There was a man who had used the fundamental forces of the universe with less ceremony than most people use a television remote, and then handed the instrument back and asked if he'd done something wrong. The world's frameworks for power, for heroism, for the upper limit of what a living being could be, none of them survived contact with that fact intact. They were rebuilt afterward necessarily, in shapes that could accommodate the evidence. But rebuilt frameworks always carry the memory of what broke them, and the shape of the break is always visible in the structure that replaces it. The Avengers, the governments, the theorists, the people who had been returned, and the people who had waited for them, all of them carried the shape of that break forward into whatever the world became next, into every decision and every structure and every assumption about what the word impossible was allowed to mean. And Saitama spent 3 weeks in a room Tony provided, watching whatever was on television, eating whatever was available, waiting for the portal home with the patient, undemanding acceptance of someone who has spent a lot of time waiting for things, and has made a kind of peace with the fact that the interesting things in life tend to arrive without warning and leave without ceremony. He did not think of himself as having saved anything. He did not think of himself as a hero in the context this universe used the word. He thought of himself as someone who had ended up somewhere unfamiliar, done what seemed practical given what was in front of him, and was now waiting to go home. The grocery sale had already ended. There would be other sales. The world was changed irrevocably and permanently, and in ways that would unfold across decades of consequence. And the man at the center of the change was sitting on a borrowed couch, watching a cooking show, and mildly hopping the next sale would have good cabbage. The portal opened on a Tuesday. He walked through it. The compound and the changed world attached to it closed behind him. He was gone before anyone had time to say anything worth saying, and the space he left behind was the shape of something the universe had briefly contained and could not explain. And the explanation was still being attempted by very intelligent people in very well-funded institutions long after the man himself had returned to City Z, where the next grocery flyer was already in his mailbox, and the evening was quiet, and nothing required immediate attention, and that was, for the moment, enough.